Really insidious thing about violent extremist ideology. You are attracted to this because you're hurting. You're attracted to this ideology, and the ideology tells you you're a warrior for your people, whoever your people are.
The problem with suicidal thoughts is how intense they are. It feels like they will never end. And when you're in that, you have this kind of tunnel vision. It feels like it's going to last forever.
Majority of people look at a homeless person. They're a drug addict. They made bad choices. If homelessness was a punishment for bad choices, we'd all be homeless.
The women that are struggling, that gives the blowjob at $5, this for me is pure 100% exploitation.
I stabbed my wife 3 times one night because she wouldn't let me finish my bottle of vodka. Still not thinking I had a drink problem.
Ultimately, 1 in 2 Americans will experience family estrangement. So that's 50% of the population.
To be completely honest with you, I am a refugee, but I'm not just a refugee.
Because I have George, I'm not George with Down syndrome or Down's George, because that's not me.
Welcome to Purposeful Empathy, a show that is dedicated to amplifying the voices of people from across the globe who understand the world needs more empathy and are doing something about it. This season will inspire you to empathize with people who are regularly marginalized and misunderstood. You won't want to miss a single episode, so hit the subscribe button now. Thanks for watching and enjoy the show.
Even though it's extremely common, it's not something that society talks about because it's sort of like a worse fear becoming materialized. So the first thing I would say is your loss is real, and it's painful. It can be painful physically, certainly emotionally. It's a contradiction. It's an oxymoron. Even the whole idea of like perinatal loss, perinatal death. It's like death and birth at the same time. You're often saying hello and goodbye at the same time, if not to a baby, to a dream, right?
Welcome to a new episode of Purposeful Empathy. Today I'm joined by Désirée McGraw, an elected member of Quebec's National Assembly for Notre-Dame-de-Grâce and Montreal West. Désirée is known not just for her policy work, but for her heart-centered leadership. She advocates for young people, community organizations, and the planet we all call home, insisting that public service must be rooted in humanity as much as in action. A devoted mother of 3 boys and a little girl, Catherine, who sadly passed away at birth, Désirée also brings deep compassion and authenticity to her public service. In fact, her work was instrumental in the adoption of Bill 595, which established October 15th as Quebec's first official Perinatal Bereavement Awareness Day, to create visibility and support for families who lose a child during pregnancy or shortly after birth. Prior to that, she led a fundraising campaign to donate refrigerated bassinets to the birthing center at Montreal's Royal Victoria Hospital to give parents facing perinatal loss the dignity of spending time with their child under supportive conditions. This season, I'm shining a spotlight on people who often feel marginalized or misunderstood, and through each conversation, my goal is to better understand lived experiences in order to widen our circle of empathy. Given her perinatal losses and how she's transformed personal grief into advocacy, I've invited Désirée, my friend, to share her story. Welcome to the show.
Thank you so much, Anita. It's always great to be with you.
Now, I want the world to know about you as a woman trailblazer, which goes back all the way to high school. So, let's color in some more about who you are and maybe can explain part of why you do what you do. Take us back. Who are you, Désirée?
Oh my goodness, what a question. Well, Anita, you and I met when I was running the Jean Sauvé Foundation with young leaders from around the world, looking to have impact really in public leadership, public policy, in the public space. And that running that foundation, and a sort of a common theme in my life has been working with the next generation to solve national and global issues, is really comes from my own experience, going back to when I was 16, actually, as a teenager in high school. At the time, it was the end of the Cold War, and studies were showing that 1 in 4 Canadian youth were looking at not get married and or have children because of the threat of nuclear war. So we grew up living in the nuclear shadow, and it was a real thing, much like climate change is an existential threat today for the planet, and particularly for young people in the next generation who will endure the most significant effects of climate change, even though we're already seeing them today. And so at 16, I joined a group called Solidarité Anti-Guerre Étudiante, and we started here in Montreal, based at the Montreal YMCA, where we met and received many invitations from across the country. So lo and behold, to make a long story short, four members of SAGE, including myself, sort of 16, 17, 18-year-olds, decided to take the show on the road and took a year off school. So I graduated from high school and then took a year off school and traveled from Newfoundland to British Columbia over the school year, reaching 1 in 4 secondary schools across Canada, to talk about the threat of nuclear war and what young people could do about it, called the SAGE Tour, La Tournée Sage. And we ended up on the front page of the Globe and Mail, and there was a National Film Board documentary made about it. And, we raised money and started organizations we raised money by selling pins and t-shirts, old school. Sometimes we get an honorarium from the schools. But we started these SAGE chapters across the country to empower young people to take action. We debated military generals. We eventually then went on to the US and the former Soviet Union to speak there as well. So, and then ultimately to the United Nations special session on disarmament. So I would say that from a young age, starting from a very local organization here at the YMCA in Montreal, we had a tour that was successful. I mean, ultimately, we were part of a much larger movement that led to a larger peace movement, if you will, that led to nuclear disarmament. And of course, now we're in a different place, and some of these issues are rearing their ugly head again. But at the time, there was a feeling of success. And my first experience trying to have impact at a young age, I would say, was a successful one. And it armed me, for lack of a better term, with a sense of a bias for action and a sense that I could make a difference. And so I've sort of grown up where a lot of young people at the time, and even today, feel a sense of apathy, not because they don't care, but because they feel that they can't have they don't feel that they can have impact. That's where you become discouraged and you kind of disengage, but not because you don't care. It's because you do care and you don't know how to have impact, or you don't feel like you can have impact. And so today we look at the climate threat, a lot of anxiety, and then if that anxiety isn't addressed through action, which is the antidote to anxiety, then it can often then lead to apathy and people disconnect. So this is something that's motivated me for much of my life, coming now almost on 40 years since I first became involved in the 80s.
And you mentioned climate change, and that's not just en passant. That is something that you actually have spent a good part of 2 decades, maybe even more, working on. So I know that you've been very involved with the Al Gore climate change movement. So maybe share a little bit about that as well.
So a lot of us in the peace movement, as things, there was some success around nuclear disarmament, again, in the late 80s. I then went on to co-host a video series called Alive in the Nuclear Age with David Suzuki. And through that work with David, I became involved in the environmental movement, as many folks who were involved in the peace movement then shifted to the environmental movement. So this is now in the early 90s. And so that's actually now 3 decades that I've been involved in environmental issues, including climate change, and then went to the Earth Summit in Rio in 1992 as a global youth ambassador, which was at the time the largest summit gathering of governments in the history of the world, which launched the Biodiversity Convention, which launched the Climate Change Convention. Ended up doing my graduate work in that field, working as a reporter for the UN, covering global environmental negotiations, and it really defined much of my career. Later on, when I had my first child, and I was working in government, Canada was hosting the first COP, climate conference of parties to the Climate Change Convention. And sorry, yes, it was the 10th COP, but the first MOP, meeting of parties. Anyway, one of these global treaties was here in Montreal, and I literally left there to go have my first child, Jack, and he'll be 20 in December. All that to say that I was up one night watching, as one often is with the new child, watching David Letterman at the time, and Al Gore was on as a guest, and David Letterman said, "Okay, well, what are you going to do for an encore? You've now got your Inconvenient Truth documentary nominated for an Oscar. You've, had all these accolades. What are you going to do?" He said, "I'm going to train 1,000 people to do a personalized, localized version of the Inconvenient Truth." And that night when I was up with Jack, I said, "I'm going to be one of those 1,000 people." And lo and behold, I was. I went down to Nashville, trained, spent the bulk of my maternity leave doing presentations all over Montreal about climate change and what we could do about it. Back to my teenage roots of doing presentation, peer-to-peer approach, which, as you know, Anita, is very effective, right? How do you really influence people? It's really through your peers, winning the conversation, influencing your peers. So I was not able to keep up with the demand for these presentations. This is now back in 2007, and decided to bring Al Gore with other presenters, other Quebec-based presenters, and actually Canadian presenters. About 20 of us worked together to bring Al Gore to Montreal, which we did in 2008, and then launched his climate reality project franchise, if you will, here in Canada, which continues to operate to this day. But my feeling was, having a child, my first child, was, it's although I'd always been involved in climate issues, a new sense of urgency that I really needed to do my part, and that really the world had engaged in planetary procrastination since I myself was a youth, and very little progress had actually been made. A lot of talk, but a lot of delays. Therefore, the planetary procrastination. So I thought, what can I do as a new mom to have impact? And that's it. We launched the Al Gore Climate Reality Project here in Canada. As I say, the organization's reached something like 5 million Canadians, and continues around the world. There's franchises all over the world and continues to have impact. So I've always felt a strong sense that you'll hear a lot of adults say, the next generation has got this. Young people are so aware, they're so engaged, all of which is true. But I also find it disingenuous and irresponsible to pass the buck to the next generation. We can't pay lip service to youth. We need to work in partnership with young people across generations. And I feel that very strongly. So yes, I have a lot of confidence in the next generation, but I also think my generation has a huge responsibility to step up, to take action now. We don't necessarily have time for the next generation to assume positions of influence and power, because the issues are so urgent. And this is partly what led me to decide to run for office.
Amen to that. And I do want to talk about that for a second, but just so you know, your impact has hit our home. My husband and I did that training, and he took it on the road to Georgia and did his 10 presentations in Tbilisi. So
of course, that's right, Anita. You're one of the climate reality ambassadors.
Right. So it's almost, there's a perfect segue to talk about you now in politics, because I'm often asked, my book is about empathy, but it's got I add the word purposeful to it, because I think we have the capacity for empathy innately to different degrees, but then we can actually turn up the volume intentionally on purpose. And I feel that public policy and politics is one of those places where we can be purposefully empathic. So I just wonder, given all the work that you did, it almost feels like you are a natural fit for politics in the best way that politics can play out. Like, you understand on the ground what's happening, you care deeply about it from a high level of integrity, and now you enter the public space. So I want to know what role you think empathy plays in politics and public policy, and what calls you to that.
So I just have to say, because you did reference your book, and I was saying I have 4 of these books. I have them different places. Anyway, it's an incredible book. And I did write a piece in Policy Options about the role of empathic action. And I love, it's empathy, right? Which can be an emotion, a feeling, but then it's how does it translate into actual concrete action? So I love your whole concept of empathic action, and I admire your work, Anita, in this really transformative field. So I just want to put that out there. I'm a fan. I'm a fangirl. So yes, I think, look, the decision to go into elective office, because I worked in politics for a former prime minister. I've been, as an advisor, I've been in and around, I've been involved in party politics, but it's something very different to put your name on a ballot, to put your face on a sign. It takes a certain amount of ego, which in some way is the opposite of empathy, but you have to have a certain amount of ego to put yourself out there. But that's where it ends, in the sense that you got to have some ego. But the question is, in politics, I always say, I'm the means to the end. I am not the end. There are some people for whom, and I put this out there because politics often gets a bad name. It's like people who are, very, self-centered, and that's not been my experience. I think most people are in politics, public office, for the right reasons. I think of course, there are exceptions, and unfortunately, they then give everyone a bad name. But most people are in it for the right reasons, which is we are the means, we are instruments of change. That the change is the much greater good that you're trying to serve through elected office. And so, I wanted to just start with that because it seems like, okay, empathic action, empathy, politics, like how do these things actually connect? And I think ultimately is about serving the common good. It is about serving the public interest. It is about serving your community, and rooted in a sense of, looking at what's happening around you in your community, in your province, in your country, and how can I be of service? I think that is rooted in empathy, a sense of being aware of some of the challenges around you. They could be rooted also in your own experience, and I know we'll talk about that later. And so for me, empathy, and in a sense, and of course, distinguishing as you do, empathy from other, pity and sympathy and compassion, but real empathy to put yourself in the shoes of another person and feel that deeply, but that then motivates you as if you are them. And I think being an élu, a representative, or in French, the word is député, you are deputized by your community. You are there as a representative of your community, representing all of the challenges of your community, of your riding. And then, of course, on a larger scale, because you represent your community, but you also have the, quote, national interest or provincial interest at heart as well. So for me, the two are deeply connected. That also, I feel a lot of, I always say I take a lot of confidence and comfort from representing my community, because I feel deeply connected to my community, the place where I was born and raised, where I'm raising my own family. And I feel like I connect with my constituents, even if I have, of course, some, less in common personally, but I think it's from a sense of empathy, of being able to connect with people on a deeper level, that you can be, truly effective, authentic, and credible.
Which is precisely why I think, and I say this with deep sincerity, how fortunate your constituents are to have you as their député. So thank you for your service. And
I feel deeply grateful to be able to represent this community. I feel honored and humbled. Truly, I do. It's a deep, it's a privilege for sure.
And here is where I might put my hand on my heart, take a nice deep breath, because I'm going to pivot the conversation to speak more personally about some losses that you've experienced. I myself have had 2 miscarriages, and I know along the way before your loss of Catherine, you had several as well. I wonder if there was a message to friends and family of people who do suffer from these kinds of losses, what you might share that could be helpful. There might be somebody listening right now who has a sister or a niece or someone in their life that's just experienced a loss like that.
So I would say your loss is real. part of what's so hard about perinatal loss, or the loss of a pregnancy, or even perinatal loss can be anywhere during your pregnancy up to 1 year following birth. Your loss is real. And especially if it happens during your pregnancy, it can feel like, is this real? Is this a real loss? Because it's not necessarily recognized. It's often taboo. It's not, even though it's extremely common, it's not something that society talks about, because it's sort of like a worse fear becoming materialized. So the first thing I would say is your loss is real, and it's painful. It can be painful physically, certainly emotionally. It's a contradiction. It's an oxymoron. Even the whole idea of like perinatal loss, perinatal death. It's like death and birth at the same time. You're often saying hello and goodbye at the same time, if not to a baby, to a dream, right? And that baby becomes, and that future becomes very real early on. So I would just want to start by saying that, and that your loss is real, and it's and there are resources as well. I mean, we can talk about that later, but where people can go to get support, but it's often not recognized. And people, in trying to be helpful, because I think, most people are coming from a good place, can often say something that's unhelpful or hurtful, like, you can try again, you're young, it wasn't meant to be, all of these things. These things are not helpful. And I would say that with the grieving process, it's not necessarily linear. It could be something later that triggers. If you go on to have another pregnancy, even though people are like, oh, you can go on, that the since my first loss, which occurred before I had my first baby born, as you mentioned, Anita, I have 3 live healthy boys, but I've had 5 losses, including Catherine. The innocence of pregnancy, you never really kind of have that again. So it can be really devastating. And no matter when it occurs, it's not about like, did it happen at 9 weeks or 20 weeks, or in my case, 36 week with my latest loss with the stillbirth of Catherine. These can be very, very painful experiences. And I would just also add, for women, these losses, certainly during pregnancy, happen in our own bodies. And it's very hard to not feel guilty about that. Who do you blame but yourself? Because it's happened in your body, something that we as women are supposed to be able to achieve. And so that sense of guilt, I want to take that sense of guilt away. I want to acknowledge it, but also take it away, because it's certainly not a thought that you had or something that you did that would have caused this, to even aggravate the sense of loss. There's so many feelings that are, and each person is different. I know in my case, later with the later loss, I actively sought help. I wish I had earlier with my earlier losses. So if you need help, reach out to a friend, reach out to a professional. We need to do more in our social services and healthcare system to support families who've experienced the 23,000 families just alone here in Quebec every year who experience perinatal loss. And that's not 23,000 a year. That means that there's many people in each of those families impacted. And it's not like the feeling of grief and loss goes away after a year. So we're actually talking about hundreds of thousands of Quebecers who are impacted by perinatal loss. So it's a significant phenomenon. It's a significant experience. Anyway, long answer to a short question, but I just wanted like the acknowledging of it, which is why I think the day that we, the October 15th, which as of 2024 is now Quebec officially recognizes, as other jurisdictions have already in other parts of Canada around the world, October 15th is perinatal and infant awareness loss bereavement day, because it's starting by saying, we see you, this is real, and we acknowledge you. We acknowledge your loss. We acknowledge your experience. There's so much more to do to support families, but we started with this really important symbolic piece, and it has the only law, Anita, so far in this mandate, and this since the last election of 2022. It's the only legislation that has been presented by a member of the opposition. So as a Liberal MNA, I'm in the opposition, that's been adopted And it's also been adopted unanimously. Every single member of the National Assembly of all four parties voted in favor unanimously. And it's the only legislation that wasn't presented by government by a member of the opposition that's been adopted, period. So I do think it speaks to the common humanity of the National Assembly. And this is when you really see politics and politicians at their best, when we come together around something very human. It could be something personal, it could be something at the local level, it could be something national, and it could be something international, a humanitarian issue. This is when you see politics and politicians at their best. And these are by far my preferred moments, because you see a lot of arguing and opposition and disagreement in politics. And I think people fixate on that. But there's also a lot of really beautiful, very human moments, and they are centered around these very human experiences that we have as human beings, as people on this planet. And they often give me hope. And so experiencing this around this support around this now law, which this bill 595, as you say, and now law, that will always stay with me. It's not why I got into politics. I got into politics on macro issues. I'm an economist by training. My work and my academically and professionally has mainly been in international relations. So it's sort of like big issues. But it's really the women that I met, my fellow MNAs, who, in talking to them as we got to know each other and learning about each other, and of course sharing these experiences of my own losses, that my fellow MNAs, women, said, you actually should do something about this. You should. And then my team, my fellow liberals, helped me figure out what does that look like. And ultimately it was tabling this bill which became law. And so I have my colleagues, mainly my women colleagues, but ultimately the whole caucus came together. And as I said, all the MNAs came together, and it was a really powerful moment. And in the wake of this bill becoming law, I had so many colleagues on my side of the aisle and across the aisle talking about their own experiences, whether it be women who had lost babies, it's men whose mothers had lost babies, their wives, their daughters, their own experiences. So I was overwhelmed with the response and personal experiences that so many people carry, but in silence and often taboo. So I think naming it and putting it out there, I hope, was an act of empathy. It certainly was rooted in empathy. And there's a lot more work to do. And I can talk about that, some of the things that we've been doing since this law was passed. But I think it is rooted in empathy. You be the judge, you're the expert, but it was coming from a place of personal experience, which unfortunately is a very common experience. And I learned, even just among my colleagues, how many of them had experiences of their own in their own families. And it's an experience that unfortunately, resonated.
Well, I listened to you, and two things really rise up to the surface. Well, actually three. It was earlier that you were talking about it was the final loss that brought you to the therapist's office, and I wonder if you might say a few words about therapy. The second thing, and I'll remind you of these if we go down a rabbit's hole and we forget. Second thing was, the lived experience of people in politics, that idea of inclusion, where people who are normally excluded from conversations and are brought into conversations, how that's game changing for how people writ large, experience the world. And then the personal story, because I think, you've named statistics of our local context of Quebec, and globally, it's in the millions. Each of those losses is a story, right? So maybe one at a time. What role did therapy play for you?
Well, why don't I connect the therapy and the personal experience, because the personal experience is what led me to getting help.
Okay.
And so, yeah, I think I had an undiagnosed autoimmune disorder, and I had, as I mentioned, several losses even before I had my first, well, really since I was first married, in fact, but didn't really understand what the common thread was. And so the doctors would always say, you can go on and have other babies. And then some of the losses, they were anywhere between like basically 12 weeks all the way up to Catherine at 36 weeks, and kind of everything in between. And didn't really understand what was happening. And ultimately I went to the MUHC, world-class hospital right here in my own riding, and they had a reproductive loss center. But ultimately nothing was really diagnosed. And, it was difficult because I'm, like you, Anita, like we're women of like heart, but also like like analytical, and we want to understand things. We want to be able to solve problems. So this felt like this complete loss of control, and obviously this deep pain with each of these losses, each in their own way. And with Catherine, I think, and one of the things I learned in therapy, particularly with this group of parents who've experienced perinatal loss, not a club that any of us had ever imagined ourselves being in, but it wasn't so much like how late or when you might have lost the baby or a pregnancy, because each person is different. And so I learned that it's like, not because I had a stillbirth so late, and I was actually scheduled for a C-section at 37 weeks. But in my case, everything was going really well. I had an ultrasound at 35 weeks, and everything was great. Everything was super healthy. It was a little girl. At this point, I had two boys. I was particularly excited to be having a little girl. But because I had previous losses, I was very careful and didn't even really do a big announcement around the pregnancy until much later. Didn't even book, didn't want a baby shower. Ultimately, my friends prevailed upon me and did a baby shower right around that time. And my mother, who's very Catholic, she's like, okay, we can book the baptism now. So let's book the baptism. So all of these things happen very, very late, like the baptism for ultimately after the baby's born. But whereas with my first children, I did these things much earlier. With Catherine, I was extremely cautious. And so I went to see the doctor. So I had this last ultrasound, everything was great. But then the following week, I wasn't feeling well. I was getting sweaty. I wasn't feeling the baby move as much. I went to see the doctor. My regular doctor was away. She was on vacation. This is now August of 2016. And so I saw a doctor who wasn't my regular doctor, and I was expressing some of these concerns to him. And he said, look, it's normal, you're in your final weeks, you're, just not feel the baby moving as much. I said, well, this is my third full pregnancy. So there's something that doesn't feel right. And unfortunately, on that day, this doctor did not do his best work. He did not send me for an ultrasound. He didn't send me for a non-stress test, any of the basic things that really should have been done. And so I left the doctor's office feeling reassured to some extent, but ultimately 2 days later, I didn't feel any better. And so I brought myself to the hospital. My husband had taken our two boys camping. They were 5 hours away. So I brought myself to the hospital saying there's something wrong. And so I got to the hospital, and at first I'm in the wrong section thinking I'm going to just emergency, and ultimately no, you need to go to the maternity ward. Anyway, they did an ultrasound, and the doctor said, there's no heartbeat. And based on this ultrasound, this baby died in the last 24 hours. And so died after I saw the doctor who sent me away. That was a tough pill to swallow, one that the baby was no longer alive, but that this doctor could have done something. And so then I said, look, I'm scheduled, so I was alone. And I reached out to my husband, and he started making his way back. But my sister was able to get on a plane from New York, and she made it to my side sooner. But I said, look, I'm scheduled for an ultrasound next week, a cesarean, because my second child, I had a cesarean. And so, after that, anyway, I said, can I have a cesarean? They said, we don't do C-sections for babies when the baby's no longer alive. And so I went through a full delivery, hours of labor, to deliver a baby who was no longer alive. And fortunately, my sister was by my side, but that was, I'll never forget that. And, it was physically and emotionally very painful. Excruciating. And I remember we stayed in the hospital, and of course I had this baby. She was 5 pounds, 3 ounces, perfect, beautiful. What happened is, I caught a virus. Myself and my younger son had caught a virus, and in catching this virus, and this is through the pathology after that said it was like a host graft rejection. And in my body fighting off this virus that my son and I had, like just like a bad flu, it basically shut down my placenta, and therefore the baby died of asphyxiation. She just didn't get the nutrients that she needed. And this is why her movements became slower. And in fighting off this virus and my body going into overdrive with this then later diagnosed autoimmune disorder, my body's in overdrive trying to fight this virus, sort of out of control. And this is what happened. And this is what I learned later through the pathology to understand what had happened. So I realized, so one, we stayed in the hospital. I had lost a baby at 19 weeks, and we left the hospital quickly and didn't really take the time to, I don't know, name her, or we knew it was a little girl also. So this time we stayed, and we stayed for a couple of days and held her. I mean, she was a perfect little baby. She was not alive. And unfortunately, though, our time was kind of ticking in the hospital because she was sort of deteriorating before our eyes. She was, this is where the Cuddle Cots initiative came from, was that there were these cuddle cots that the hospital didn't have at the time. So along with 3 other mothers here in NDG in the riding, we launched this Cuddle Cots initiative to bring this first sort of refrigerant, like a little cradle with a refrigerant, to preserve babies who are no longer alive, so that families who chose to, not impose, but offer to families who wanted to spend more time with their baby could do so in an unrushed manner. And studies show that if you are able to do that, it does help with the grieving process. So I was not afforded that opportunity. And in fact, some parents, because the care is very uneven over Quebec, you might be put in a maternity ward with babies being born, babies crying, while you're holding a baby that you've lost. So there's a lot of things that need to change when you do your follow-up. You have to go back into the maternity area, and you're surrounded by pregnant moms. Or you also have physical effects after you have a baby, where your milk may come in. I mean, all of these things that are not really addressed. And so there needs to be much better quality of care across the board in Quebec. And this is one of the things beyond the law that we're working on, is to make sure that there are supports, regardless of whether you are in Quebec, that you have the supports that you need. And the Cuddle Cots are now, so we did manage to raise the money. We brought the first Cuddle Cot to Quebec at the MUHC, and that was in 2018. And then since then, there's a foundation called La Fondation La Berceuse, who's an amazing woman named Catherine Buret that we've been working with, that is basically bringing Cuddle Cots across the province. And so, so I think that experience obviously was devastating. The empathy I experienced, though, from our community, and I think a lot of families live this silently and alone. Well, one of the things that we did, because no one gives you a book, like how do you handle this kind of loss? We ended up, we had a funeral, and 200 people in our community came and honored Catherine, and we buried her in our family plot. And all of these things that we did really helped with the grieving process. But I understood that by the nature of this loss, I would need more help than just community support, even though that was extraordinary. The empathy that was demonstrated by our friends and family in our community to acknowledge this loss as real. I got help. So Chris and we joined a group that was made available through the MUHC for parents who'd experienced perinatal loss. And that was every second Monday. And then on the other alternating Mondays, I booked myself into individual therapy with an incredible psychotherapist and therapist here in NDG named Rosa Caporici. And she was one of the moms ultimately with whom I worked to bring the Cuddle Cots campaign. And so I was very deliberate. I was also, older, and I kind of had enough life experience to know I need to deliberately access help. But it was private help, and a lot of families don't have access to that. So the parents group was funded publicly through the MUHC, but the private help was not something that I would have been able to access if I didn't have some means of our own. And so this is why we're working to ensure that all parents, all women, mothers, but also fathers, families have access to help. Also, the impact on my two boys was extraordinary, and also accessed privately a child psychologist to help work with our whole family and my children, my live children in particular. And so realizing the privilege that I had of being able to access these resources privately meant that, as a politician that in public office was like, okay, what can we do to make sure that all families, regardless of their own personal background or where they happen to live, have access to these supports. And so the therapy, both with other parents, but also privately, was really important. And then working with Rosa Caparici, who later then inspired the legislation because she was working with parents. She continued her work with parents who'd experienced perinatal loss. And then in May of 2023, so within a year of my election, she invited me to speak. And the group was meeting here in NDG. And they issued a challenge to me to actually do something in the public policy field to make progress on this issue. And so it was a community initiative. In fact, it was these other parents and Rosa who inspired me to go forward with this law. And I worked closely with Rosa and others to make this a reality. So it was actually rooted, yes, in my own experience, but very much rooted in a community initiative. And it was called the Unexpected Project. And so I was inspired by these other parents and brought back to my own, it reconnected me with my own experience that I'm in a position of privilege to be able to do something about this. And that certainly guided me. And so we moved forward with Rosa and others to bring this legislation forward. And there were maybe half a dozen or 10 women and organizations that were with me the day that it was adopted. And from that experience, we created in Quebec a table de concertation, which is basically a regroupement, a group of organizations, experts, and individuals, over a dozen, to come together, expertise and or lived experience around perinatal loss. And we now have been working together. There was to advocate for more change. And we always said that this law was the first step, necessary but not sufficient, the first step. And so now we've sponsored what's called a mandat, an initiative of mandate to go to the government. We were just around Perinatal Loss Day this year in October. Earlier this month, we were all at the national legislature. I invited them to join me. We did a press conference and we deposited this initiative to call on the government to have a special commission to hear from experts and people with lived experience to look at, one, better care across the province, but also in our QPIP, our Quebec Parental Insurance Plan, to recognize this loss. So we had testimonials from, for example, a father who'd lost his son, his baby, at 8 months. Within 2 weeks, his wife lost her parental benefits. She had to be back at work and didn't have any benefits. And also to recognize that those benefits, so first of all, fathers have no access. So wherever there's a loss, a father would have no access to any benefits in the wake of a loss. And if the loss occurs before 20 weeks pregnancy, during the pregnancy, before 20 weeks, so for a mother and certainly not for a father, they would have no supports, they would have no benefits. So we're looking to change that. There's a surplus right now within that program, and to direct some of that to parents who've experienced, and I call them parents because you're a parent, regardless if you have other live children, you are a parent, you have lost a child. And so we're working on that. We're actively working on that right now. And there'll be many other initiatives that come out of this, starting with the symbolism of the day. And I think it's always coming from that place of personal experience, but also listening to others and their stories and their experiences of loss that continues to motivate me and this group who want to move forward on this sort of taboo, complex issue.
I'm I'm struck by how much purpose you bring to the work that you do around this particular issue, especially given your lived experiences. And I just want to acknowledge the vulnerability it takes to revisit your loss in this way and to share with the public. I know that there is at least one person, but more for sure, but at least one person that will benefit from hearing about your experience and knowing that they're not alone and that they might find the resources that they need to transcend the loss. I want to pick up on one part of your narrative that speaks to me. You were very generous in how you described the doctor's not best day. And I teach a course on happiness right now at McGill, and one of the topics we look at is forgiveness and the importance of forgiving yourself, but also forgiving others, and that forgiving others doesn't mean that they're off the hook. It just means that you don't hold the toxic of whatever is so painful. I just wonder how you have grappled with forgiveness in light of that bad, not best day.
Yeah, thank you for picking up on that, Anita. I think we did go through a process. I actually did bring a complaint. It was actually other doctors who, and this is rare, what other doctors will say you need to issue a complaint about another doctor. I'm not going to name anyone, but on the recommendation of some doctors, they said this is really egregious and you should actually make a complaint. And ultimately, because I was really spending my time trying to actually my go-to is the public side or the advocacy side because of my background, right? As I said, since I was 16, I had this very positive experience with advocacy. So that's a bias I have and a comfortable place for me. I know it isn't for a lot of people, but for me it is. The personal stuff is harder for me. So I deliberately did the therapy, the parental support group. It was like very deliberate and intentional. And I remember I'd go home after dropping my kids off at the bus stop to go to school, and you go home to an empty house, you're expecting to have a baby. You've been looking forward to having a baby. And even though in my case, I was very like cautious and careful, ultimately I embraced like, okay, this baby's actually coming. And then ultimately, she never came home. Then I would work through each day. It would be like, okay, this morning I'm going to just own this grief and this loss. And then days would get better as I would have more and more of my days would then just be more interacting with the world. Anyway, where am I going with this? I think with the doctor, I did ultimately make a deliberate decision because I was encouraged by other doctors and I recognized like legitimately that this was a real fail. And I didn't want this to happen to other people, right? That this doctor should be reprimanded or at least made aware of his, I think that day not really doing justice. It was Hippocratic oath. I think harm was done. There was no do no harm. Harm was done through a failure to do the very basic follow-up. Ultimately, that didn't go anywhere. They didn't rule in my favor, and I or in favor of. There were no consequences for this doctor. It's not like I want him to lose his license, but I just thought, something needed to be done. And that didn't happen. And so I had to let that go in the sense that I followed that process. Others said, take legal action, ultimately didn't follow that. So when I became an elected official, and again, it wasn't my purpose going to politics, but when my colleagues, when they understood my story, I said, you really need to do something about this. This is like, okay, I can do something. I have some agency here. I can help other people rooted in my own experience, which is still, I don't, I've talked about it now publicly and I'm able to talk about it, but it's still, you never get, you never get over it. Like so much grief, you have to live life. It coexists, right? And, they say grief is the price you pay for love. And so you don't necessarily want to get over it because you always will love this child. And I will say, I see, neighborhood kids who Catherine would be their age today and she'd be going into grade 3. And I think about all those milestones. And I also say, no matter how much we've accomplished through this loss and our collective losses, I would give just one day with her alive for all of that. So it never leaves you. And I've spoken to people who've come to me, women who are in their 80s, who talk about their experiences. So I know the grief never leaves you. You don't forget ever. And so, yes, so so I realized that my purpose, if you will, talking about purposeful empathy, that there's a purpose. Instead of denying it, just own it. Just own your own experience. And what I have learned is you can go into whatever profession, you can be motivated by all kinds of things. As I have been in politics around climate change and macro issues, that's been my comfort zone. But I've accepted at this stage of the game that actually so much of your credibility comes through your authenticity, and it's being connected to your own experience, your own lived experience. Yes, we have our professional expertise and our degrees, and that's important. Don't get me wrong. And for women, it's particularly important because we always have to demonstrate our credentials. But it is not a weakness to embrace the personal and the lived experience. It is a strength. And I don't know if proud is the word, but I'm glad that I was able to connect with that and then connect with others who are doing extraordinary work with families themselves, and with families who've experienced perinatal loss, and that's part of my purpose. And I accept that. And I accept it with humility. So, and gratitude in many ways as well.
Speaking of gratitude, I have a lot of gratitude to share for this incredible conversation on Halloween Friday. Before I get there, there's one question I ask all my guests at the end of the interview, and that might allow us to end on a sweet note here. Can you think of a time in your life when you were on the receiving end of empathy, a specific moment, and what that meant for you?
There have been, yeah, I think I because we're so in this, Anita, I will share this. I think the empathy I have experienced in relation to my losses, and especially the loss of Catherine, because that was for me, the sort of transformative experience. As I say, that the friends and family and community who came out for Catherine's funeral, that was like, we see you, and that loss is real. I think my colleagues in the National Assembly, both in my own party, who encouraged me to go forward with legislation, and then honestly, in the National Assembly, standing up and having to speak about this experience that motivated this law, the tabling of this law, and then the unanimous support with leaders of all parties getting up and speaking, and men getting up and speaking. That was extraordinary. I will never forget that. It was ultimately an outpouring of empathy, not just for me, but for the 20,000 families a year who experience perinatal and infant loss. It was deeply personal and incredibly humbling and inspiring. I feel like that was a moment that I am personally proud of, but I think that the National Assembly should be proud of this expression of our deepest common humanity. And so I think I'd be remiss as a public official, as an elected official, to not talk about that collective empathy in a place in the National Assembly that is often known for, deep, intense, hot, heated debate on all kinds of issues. It's known more for its opposition and confrontation than for its compassion and empathy. And on that day and in that moment, it was all about empathy. And I will, I think, forever be most proud of that in terms of my public record.
In the show notes to this episode, we're going to have information about Cuddle Cots and resources for families who go through these kinds of losses. We'll have information about your bill so that maybe someone in another jurisdiction somewhere else might also feel inspired to bring that forward to their representatives, or they themselves might try to urge something along. Those are all the ways that people can get informed and advocate on behalf of people who have had losses. So thank you for your service as a public official. Thank you for your time, and thank you for thank you for sharing. I was there to see you as a beautiful pregnant lady. I was there at Catherine's funeral. I've been at her gravesite with you, and I continue to bless her and your family. And I want to thank you for sharing your story today.
Thank you, Anita, for including me, and thank you for your friendship. You've been there from the start through to this, and I admire you and all of the work that you continue to do. You are an inspiration, and you're a true friend.
And with that, ladies and gentlemen, we'll see you next week at Purposeful Empathy.
If you know someone who would benefit from this episode, please share it with them now. Post the link to your socials, and don't forget to hit the subscribe button. The world needs more empathy, and you have an important role to play.